And we have had a really wonderful turnout tonight. It's great to see so many people online tonight. We'd like to welcome you, as well as those who are watching on our Facebook Live right now, and those who are listening in tomorrow on J-Air or watching our YouTube recording. Tonight we were talking about the enemies within, Jews who betray their own people, with our special guest, Yisrael Medad. The phenomenon of Jews turning against their own people is not new, but it is severely damaging. You know the expression, one Jew, two opinions. We're a religion that allows lots of opinions and we allow healthy discussion and openness. But what happens when differences in opinions becomes dangerous? And what is the explanation between the hatred within? Our guest Yisrael Medad is a columnist for the JPost, JNS, and other outlets. He has served as an aide and advisor to several ministers and Knesset members. He was the director of educational programming at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center and a member of the Betar World Executive. If you have any questions tonight, I remind you to please use the raise hand button, and we will get to your questions in the Q&A section after the presentation. Please welcome our guest, and thank you very much for joining us, Yisrael Medad.
Thank you for having me on. It's a privilege, and I hope that the information we exchange and the opinions I express and those that I hear will help everybody understand the issue and related issues as well. Just to give a little bit more background, I was born in the United States. The first time I met an Australian was back in 1966 when I was here in Israel on the Mahon Lemadrakei Chutz La'aretz program for youth leaders of Zionist youth movements. My wife and I returned on Aliyah in 1970, and in 1981, we moved to where I am now speaking to you from, Shiloh, which is a community village about 25 miles north of Jerusalem in what we call today the region of Binyamin, which most people would either call Judea and Samaria or something to do with a bank. Since I do not have that much money, I do not use that term as it does not prove to be very helpful to me in any case. Directly to the issue in which I was asked to address. I've been writing some articles these past few years to that issue of Jews who, and I'm working on a new article, who have unsettled souls. They cannot find themselves within the normative framework of being not only Jewish, but a normative human being. I've been looking around, and if anybody can inform me where I'm wrong, I will be more than happy. I have checked Greeks, Armenians, French, English, Germans, people from South America who have become expatriates and are living in another country rather than the country either they were born in or where their family has come from. And I cannot find any sort of similar phenomenon of what I guess we can call anti-Zionist Jews. Now it has become much more pronounced, but of course we've always had this problem. Let me give you some historical background just to put things in perspective so you don't feel so bad that things seem to be worse than they could be or should be. Back in 1919, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States of America was going off in January of that year to participate in the Versailles Peace Treaty. America at the time was still very much, and would be for a while, non-involvement engaged, if I can put it that way. This is before appeasement, but there was America strong. For example, America never joined at that stage the League of Nations, but it was part of the peace conference. 299 Reform rabbis, so there wasn't conservative or liberal rabbis at that time, signed a letter to him to have him deny any American involvement in any recognition of Jewish nationalism or a future state of the Jewish people. In other words, what I called in several of my articles an eliminationist theory of Jewish existence. We should not have the state of Israel. We should not have any national feelings. We should not feel any sort of sympathy, identity, or association with something called Judea, Israel, whatever name at that time, of course, was bandied about, what we call today the state of Israel. Some of that, of course, at that specific moment, and the incident I'm talking about, came from a reform interpretation of Judaism. Judaism had left nationalism behind. Our ideals and our values were to be spread worldwide. And between us and God was a private matter. Anything else was simply a matter of ethics and morals that we Jews brought a certain experience with us. That meant, of course, taking Zion out of the prayer book, taking sacrifices and any mention of the temple out of the prayer book. And everything became standing on one foot. If you remember that story about what is Judaism. At that time, though, there was also the Bundists in the last decade of the 19th century who viewed socialism as replanting or substituting for Judaism, and that all the social, economic even, and moral values of Judaism were to be transplanted into a new form of socialism. That didn't work out too well, as we know, in the 1930s, during the Stalinist trials, and then during the actual executions at that time in the late 30s and into the 1940s. But nevertheless, in my opinion, a remnant of both that, shall we call it, religious anti-nationalist sentiment, and Judaism is globalism and socialism, has reappeared every once in a while over the past few decades. And now, okay, I do not see it up close, but I do have a computer. As most of you know, you can simply find anything you want on the internet, or anything you don't want, but you happen to be, unfortunately, looking for. And we see groups like, I think in England, I think it's called Na'amod. In the United States, we have If Not Now. If Not Now actually was spawned by Peter Beinart, whose name may be familiar to you, who started out about a dozen or 13 years ago to take on the American Jewish establishment. He was a Zionist. Okay, we Zionists have opinions. 2 states, 1 state, condominium, autonomy. I mean, there have been plans over the past 50 years, every single one of them, of course, including partition from the 1930s, rejected by the Arab side. But that doesn't confuse us. We come up with more plans. And then eventually, if I'm not mistaken, about 3 years ago, 2.5 to 3 years ago, when you're getting older, time flies faster for those who happen to be over the age of 50. He did not want any Jewish state. He came out in a New York Times article, and If Not Now, following his lead, and for those who maybe are armored up for Jewish anti-Zionism, can go on Instagram and see that they're adopting, in my opinion, anti-Semitic memes of anti-AIPAC, and genocide and Jews with money and Jewish media, all these things, and their sidekicks, whether they want them or not, are the Jewish voices for peace who are outright not only pro-Palestinian in terms of Hamas, even Fatah, but they try to bring down not only Zionism, but Jewish social and communal structures and institutions. I recently read of some sort of incident of doxing that happened to Australian Jewry. I do not know the background of the reporter involved, but I have a funny feeling that at least the person she gave the information to was of this type of ideology, that Zionism is so bad. Zionism is so evil. The people of the former Palestine Mandate are so deserving of a state, then you can do anything you want to them. You can support Arab terror. You can go to the Democratic National Convention and demonstrate. And you'll excuse me for not being totally up to date on the Australian scene, but I understand that you have had problems, including physical problems, with people who cannot tell the difference between a Jew and a Zionist, and therefore the synagogue or the community center or the Jewish person, him or herself, becomes the object of hate and even violence. And in one of the articles I wrote in 2018 at JNS, I tried to warn these Jewish anti-Zionists where they were going. And it wasn't a matter anymore of politics or opinions or ideology. What was becoming involved, they were facilitating. They were acting as a transferal agent of non-Jewish hate, giving it, can I use the word, the kosher label, and allowing it to happen. They weren't just hoping to help the Arabs. They were actually getting involved in harming Jews. Palestine from the river to the sea is not just a slogan. It's not just a chant. As many people I've seen on the internet and Twitter try to point out, it means no Israel. And no Israel means, look what the rest of the Middle East is. Hundreds of thousands of Jews had to flee Arab lands after 48, Egypt after 1956. And except perhaps for Morocco, the Isle of Jerba, and maybe a few pockets here and there, you have no Jews in the Arab world. And there's a reason for that. And if that's the reality, the chant of Palestine from the river to the sea is no Jews. And it doesn't mean putting them on buses or driving them down to the airport or to Haifa port. We've seen what Hamas has done on October 7th. And we've seen for the past 10 months now, at least, a fomenting frenzy of anger and justification on the one hand, and a refusal to accept that there were rapes, that there were incinerations, that there were brutal murders, beheadings. And this is not new. To my audience, anybody who does a search on Hebron, August 1929, will see the chopping off of fingers, the rapes, gougings, burning alive. It's not new. It's not because of Zionism per se. It's not because the state of Israel. If we, those who I think are faithful, do not recognize how bad these things can devolve down the sewer of anti-Zionism, we're in for a lot of trouble. Even if you feel uncomfortable with Israeli politics, and you are free to do that, there is a limit to what the quote unquote punishment should be. We're a democratic country. The citizens can be convinced to vote this way or that way. In fact, starting back in 2015, and I won't go back to the 1996 election where United States President Clinton came and tried to help his friend with his famous Shalom Chaver business with Shimon Peres. But at least since 2015, we've had not only private Jewish money or other money, we've had State Department, United States State Department movement making its way to NGOs who are trying to change the minds of Israelis. So there's a lot of latitude out there to satisfy your anti-Zionism without latching on to the worst of the Arab terror actions and ideology that exists. I don't think I need to go any further on that. I hope I've made myself clear, and I hope I've allowed the audience enough food for thought so that I can continue on this issue or any other issue that the audience would like to ask me. And if that's okay with my gracious hosts, unless they have a specific question for me to clarify, I am willing to open up the floor for questions.
Sure, no, that's perfect. And I think we'll have a lot of questions. That was a very good talk, very good introduction to the topic. And we'll just say we found out today from Hugh Kitson, who unfortunately couldn't make it, but he said you were one of the advisors on Whose Land, Part 1.
That is true. Hugh and I go back at least a dozen years or so, and we've been in communication since. So yes, please convey regards to him.
Well, yeah, so we were very involved as well in helping with some of the funding and the promotion and screening of Whose Land here in Australia. So it's a very good connection to know about. Now, before we go to some audience Q&A, and I'll just remind everyone to, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand with the hand emoji, as I see some people have, and we've got questions coming in. Before we do that, just remind everyone that if you aren't already supporting the AJA some way, please do so, whether that's by making a donation, following AJA on all the social medias, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, making sure, obviously, you're subscribed to the emails, those type of things. Next week, we will have a very interesting Zoom coming up. We have Einat Wilf. She's a former member of the Knesset for the Labour Party, but we won't hold that against her, but she's come around quite a bit in her views, and she's speaking a lot of common sense, and it will be good to hear from her. She'll be talking about, particularly about UNRWA, which we know is an issue, and we know the Albanese government is unfortunately sending a lot of taxpayer money to UNRWA. Now, we're about to go to questions. Daniel will take question time. I think we just had a question from our good friend, Eddie Boaz. Eddie is a Holocaust survivor and a good friend of and member of the AJA. So Eddie, if you could unmute, thank you. And
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Robert. Good evening. My name is Eddie Boas. I'm a Holocaust survivor, as Robert just said. And what I want to just bring up, and that's been bugging me for quite a while now, since October 7 started, is Jews turning on Jews. And I'm only going to speak mainly about Australia, because that's what I'm a bit knowledgeable about, not about America. In Australia, we've got 120,000 Jews. We have many organizations, about 25, if not more, serving these people. the Jewish people. I've lived in Australia since I was 14 years old. Came out here with my widowed mother. My father died just after the war. We spent 4 months in Westerbork camp and 14 months in Bergen-Belsen. We went in as a family, we came out as a family, which is unusual according to Yad Vashem. So my father died just after the war in 1948, and my mother decided to immigrate to Australia, where I've lived since I was 14 years old. And Australia was the perfect country to come for Holocaust survivors. It was a long way from Europe. They could leave all their sorrows behind and start a whole new life. And this went on till around the 1990s, when integration was no longer the thing for immigrants, but multiculturalism became the big thing. And I believe that everything that's happening in Australia today has been caused by multiculturalism. I believe that when you go from your country to a country that you come and live, like from Holland to Australia, that's the country you've got to be loyal to. And what happened here after October 7, to me, the most disgraceful part of all that is Jews turning on Jews. And that happened in Australia where, and I say this because that's what I believe, and what I've read and what I've spoken to, who I've spoken to, that a lot of this Jew on Jew is led by academics and as teachers, lawyers, educators. And I cannot understand that, and neither can the Jewish community that I know. And maybe you can answer, why is this happening? Because
I will try to give you some assistance, perhaps. It just so happens that hopefully tomorrow in the Jerusalem Post I have a op-ed on 2 academics in the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem who promote the idea of settler colonialism, and of course apply that the formula to Zionism and what the Jews are doing in Israel. And one particular line caught my eye, and it was that Israel is a place to where European refugees fled from European anti-Semitism. Now, academics, as you point out, are the root of the problem here. About 70% of them, I think, are Marxists. And therefore, if anything does not fit an economic understanding of anything, it's bad. And Zionism, maybe very early on, was very socialist, but for the past 30 more years or so, Israel has become high-tech and commercial and one of the most economic successful countries because they left socialism behind. But anybody, especially Israelis, who refuse to accept the fact that over 1,800 years, Jews have constantly been coming back to the land of Israel. Maybe not in the thousands or tens of thousands, but anybody who reads the Talmud knows of the sages who moved from Babylon to Israel. Anybody who knows anything about the Hasidim knows that in 1777, 300 came back to the land of Israel. The students of the Vilna Gaon, the Kabbalists in Sfat in the 16th century. You cannot say that Jews are Zionists and come to Israel as refugees. We're coming home. The psalmist how can I sing the song of Zion on Babylonian soil? I mean, this is astounding. So basically, my short answer to you now is that these people want to be accepted in a society that will not accept them unless they strip themselves of 90% of their identity. And all they want to hear from Jews are a few jokes, a little bit of economic wisdom, not too much because then you become the upper class, and a little bit of fashion. More than that, don't bother us with Jews living together as Jews. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Yisrael, and thank you, Eddie. And I just forgot to mention before as well, if you wanted to purchase Whose Land, which we mentioned that Yisrael was an advisor on, you can do that on the AJA website, jewishassociation.org.au/shop, and the link is also in the chat. Now, just to give a bit of Australian context, so obviously we also have, self-hating Jews, Jews who turn against the community here in Australia of varying levels. Many people would be familiar with the newly formed little group, I think the Jewish Council, they call themselves. So they're very small in number, but they are able to do a lot of damage, and obviously they get a lot of attention with the left-wing state broadcasters here, the ABC, SBS. Also got a long-established group, the AJDS, Australian Jewish Democratic Situation, and they're also a very minuscule group. They recently got in some trouble for making false accusations against a synagogue. They said that a synagogue hosted an event which it did not host. So we've got a few different things going on in Australia. But over to you, Tennille, to take some questions.
Thank you. I'll remind everybody, if you have a question, to raise your hand, or you can private message me in the chat if you don't feel like going on camera. We'll go to our good friend of the AJA, Michael Bird. Please unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
look, we have Jewish groups, anti-Israel Jewish groups in Australia, similar to the United States. We've got New Israel Fund, one of the biggest J Street representatives. What is most annoying is when these Jews go onto the media to vilify Israel, they usually start off with, well, we're the sons or the daughters of Holocaust survivors and we were refugees. And they try and bring up their Jewishness or their Jewish past as like a tool to give extra credibility to their potential vilification of Jews in Israel. Is that what you find in your research?
I don't know how many people in Australia are aware of Howard Jacobson, who is a Jewish author and playwright and screenwriter, if I'm not mistaken, in England. He wrote a book a few years ago, and maybe the title will come to me by the time I finish answering. But he introduced the term in one word, as a Jew. If you people are with me, you'll know that every time you hear someone, as you say, on the media or on the internet or even in articles, as a Jew, and then I hate Israel, or as a Jew, Israel is wrong. And the joke that used to go around was the only time they're Jewish is when they're anti-Israel. Because otherwise they usually aren't that involved in Jewish community affairs or even synagogue going once in a while. But the point is, they have a psychological, in my opinion, need, an urge to sort of exhibit themselves. And their ear is tuned to the fact that not too many people like Israel. It's not that not too many people like Israel. It's not too many people who are listening to like Israel. who appear on television. If you go down the street and ask, you know, do you feel for Israel? Are you anti or pro-Israel? I'm willing to wager that most of the time you'll get positive answers. There are pro-Israel. But when you get to the small screen television or telly, I don't know exactly what the term is in Australia, right? Or you're listening to the radio. And don't forget, as we go on year after year, usually the reporters, the editors, most importantly, and the show hosts and interviewers become younger. They're not educated the way we were 20 years ago. They don't have the same information. They don't even read books anymore that we used to do in school. And so you're talking to a more and more ignorant group of people who manage and conduct the discourse that we hear. And it gets more and more unfactual, fake, and willing to believe the most outrageous claims. And therefore, if I can make any sort of recommendation to the Australian community, Jewish community, to you people in specific, find ways of outreaching to media personalities, not shouting and yelling and thumping on the table, but workshops and other soft power ways in order to try to steer the conversation into a more objective and a more neutral type of platform. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. We'll go to Alan Friedman, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tennille. Yisrael, Melbourne, Australia, which is where I am, and which is where approximately half of Australia's Jews live, became the biggest community of Holocaust survivors in the world after the war. And quite a number of the survivors who settled here in that post-war era were Bundists from Poland who celebrated Jewish culture, but not religious Zionism or Jewish nationalism of any sort. Now, Judaism has room for a broad range of views, but how prevalent is this movement in Israel or elsewhere in the world? And are they still having much of an influence?
Well, I do have a graduate degree in political science, as it happens. And I don't want to get too historical, but let's not forget, both in Australia and in England, you had a very large and very powerful and a governing labor movement. And labor, of course, was socialist. The United States socialism never really caught on. Today, of course, we have something called progressivism and other forms, but still America is not the same type of society which welcomes socialism. It was viewed as a foreign power, an alien power, a subversive force, in fact, which never developed as it did both in Australia and England, to the best of my knowledge. So that here in Israel, I've tried to make a bit of criticism of, and I don't want to get off the topic too much, so let me try to be direct. The demonstrations we have seen against the government over the past 3, 4, even 5 years, I think officially it started in 2019. What we, for short term, we call it here the Kaplan Force, or the anti-judicial reform demonstration. I once tried to analyze it as the children of the Histadrut hegemony. And for those who think they know more than the average person on Israel society, have to understand, up until 1977 and in the early 80s, the Histadrut and the Mapai complex ruled Israel, not only economically, but politically, socially, and culturally. You couldn't get your play shown at Habima if you weren't, if I can use shorthand, from the gang, from the brothers. And then the army was involved because, fortunately, many kibbutz boys went into the elite units and moved up the ranks. And so the officer corps, unlike today, which is very religious nationalist, if I can use that phrase, right? At that time was different. You were the kibbutznik, you were the sons of the Palmach. And that interlocking situation, in my opinion, led to, and I'm trying not to be a Marxist here, led to a class struggle between those who grew up in the old Mapai type of a friends network, okay, and those who came from the Mizrahi, the Sfaradi, the religious communities, and it become more pronounced in Israel society. And all of a sudden, the old Mapai, the old Avodah, the old labor movement, lost its demography. Losing their demography means they're losing elections. And they're very angry. That anger or that frustration, I think, can be seen in some of the anti-Zionism that we have seen in Australia, United States, and England most specifically, because to those countries, and you'll correct me about Australia, a lot of Israelis have gone on what we call Yeridah, on leaving the country to make a new home in other places. And they bring that frustration and even anger with them and try to whip it up within the local Jewish community. But at least in Australia, I'm guessing on America and in England, where I lived for 2 years, I'm a little bit more sure that I'm pretty much on point on that element.
Thank you, Israel. We'll go to Solomon, who's coming to us live from space. Would you please unmute?
I've just gone. Thank you very much. My question's in 3 parts, looking at social structures, the left-right politics and unity, and the separation of church and state. Are not present times the ones in which we need social structures most to be a uniting force behind true social cohesion? In terms of left-right politics and unity, is there too much focus on the left-right political spectrum when we need one community as a united voice for Israel? And lastly, the issue of separation of church and state. Australia prides itself on having just that, yet Israel, as a functioning democratic state, is plagued by non-separation of religious and state, with so much angst centred around those very issues rather than running the country for all citizens. Your comments, please.
Well, okay, I'll admit that's a hard question to answer in its 3 parts. When you say Israel is a democratic state, many people err and think democracy is just voting once every 4 years or so. Democracy means that a society evolves and a society develops. A society moves on. You cannot take a picture of Israel in 1955 or 1935 and expect it to remain, as an example, the socialist kibbutz heaven it once was. In fact, we have a good few politicians, including the former prime minister, at least of England, who experienced the kibbutz early on and come back after 20 years and find out that we've moved on. We've got Herzliya and high tech. We've got Elbit We've got space, real space, right? We've got satellites, and that affects Israeli society in all sorts of ways. And we have development of religion. I mean, whether or not you like it or whether or not you think it's great, and I'm open on that point. I'm not going to, force anybody into believing it or not. But the amount of religiosity that you see in the armed forces, the saying of Shema, the dancing, and the carrying of the Torah scrolls into battle. I'm willing to suggest that after the war is over, half of what we saw will disappear. And at this moment, though, it's very important for them to feel the fervor, to feel the security that a belief system can give you. And to deny this on the one hand, or to denounce it on the other, as some sort of fanaticism, rather than an honest, if not physical, psychological need of people at this crucial time when we face the most horrific event collectively as a Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust, is not being fair to what I pointed out before, the evolving, developing society of Israel as a democratic community. And people trying to hold us back, trying to pour cold water on it or to make fun of it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go on to the Haaretz website and pick a few articles. I think we have to allow ourselves some sort of latitude here to go through a period of time and not just say at this very moment, it's bad, it's good. It's ongoing, and we need the space to see where we are. That's the best I can do in response to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take a question from the chat now. Zachariah, do you know what drives this group to turn against the community? What are they hoping to achieve? Who is backing them? So I guess both financially and ideologically. And what is their end goal?
Well, I mean, I don't know if there's a specific group or a local Australian group that's being referred to. Being a non-Australian and never having even visited Australia, and I do not intend to, and please do not take that personally. Look, you have a person like George Soros. A couple of years ago, I was very, very critical of George Soros on the internet, specifically on Twitter. I did not refer to him being Jewish. In fact, I tried even not to mention the fact that he was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, because he was a youngster at the time. I'm not even sure exactly how old, but he was a teenager, I think, 14, 15 maybe. But every time I brought up George Soros's world globalism outlook, is funding all sorts of organizations and NGOs and movements and stuff like that, many of which are anti-Israel and anti-Zionist. All I got from leading journalists who I know personally, Jewish journalists, who you probably even read yourself sometimes, is you're feeding the anti-Semites. You're helping the anti-Semites. And I said, no, Mr. George Soros is doing something that I think is wrong. I don't care if he's a Buddhist. I can't criticize him. And then I saw this attitude developing and growing more and more. And then all of a sudden, you get the averse side of that attitude. They begin canceling Jews and Zionists and pro-Zionists. On the one hand, the demand for us not to criticize something we see as wrong, because it might be interpreted and helping the anti-Semites. On the other hand, they will help the anti-Semites and attack Jewish pro-Zionists. So it's really become pathological. It's really become nonsensical and irrational. And once the political or ideological argument moves into that field, ladies and gentlemen, or anything in between, right? We are in trouble because they cannot make a value judgment, the people we're talking about. You can point out to them, but it says in the book, and they'll go to somewhere else to find another book that says exactly the opposite, which is wrong, which is, for example, happening in Wikipedia, if I can just throw that in. Be very careful using Wikipedia. It's an organized campaign to distort and to defraud your mind through Wikipedia articles. So my point is, and perhaps I mentioned it more than once already, is we're not dealing with something that that the other side can calmly discuss. It's a matter of in their souls, if I can use that phrase, because we're Jewish and Jewish souls are a good thing to talk about. They get very upset and angry about their own identity, and in order to save that identity, they will destroy yours.
Thank you, Israel. Harold, would you like to unmute, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Israel,
Yes.
thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your knowledge. I want to ask you about Jewish leadership in Australia. Now, I know you don't know much about Australia, so I'll just sum up for you very quickly. We have the AJA, we have Sherry Markson, and I mean, that's about it. And if you talk about strong Jewish leadership, the exemplar for that would be, say, Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein in South Africa. So what we have here, aside from David Adler and the AJ, I think doing a very good job, and Sherry Markson, there's a vacuum bigger than the great outdoors where strong Jewish leadership should be. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have all these non-Jews standing up for us. On Sky News alone, there's 4 or 5 of them providing strong Jewish leadership, even though they are not Jews. So my question is, well, first I'd like you to comment on that. And also the question is there anything we can do, or, have you got any advice for us on what we can do about what I think is the absence of strong Jewish leadership with very few exceptions?
In my youth, the worst enemy we had was Jewish establishment figures. If anybody recalls the Soviet Jewry campaign of the late 60s and through the 70s, before it became fashionable, the worst people that stood in our way of an activist struggle with the establishment people. And I will admit to a youthful crime, perhaps, on the issue of Jewish community services. I once broke in with another 20 to 30 people into the Jewish Federation of New York, took over the switchboard, and grabbed all the chairs, and secretaries had to stand. Because I was brought up on the Jewish establishment of the 1930s and early 40s, which completely failed the Jews of Europe in the Holocaust. Kowtowing to the Democratic Party at the time, and FDR, the president in particular. So perhaps unfairly to the issue, you're talking to someone who is not very happy about Jewish establishment figures, Hollywood stars, and other people who get the limelight and avoid helping other Jews. So, not knowing specifically the Australian scene that well, I cannot make any specific suggestions. What I can do is, first of all, do not be afraid of being an independent voice yourselves. The future of the Jewish people, the future of Jews, the future of Israel depends on those people who are willing to stand up. So whether or not the pressure is on, pressure can be overcome. One day you will find that millionaire, like some people in the United States found, for example, the owner of the New England Patriots, who dumped $1 million on Yeshiva University to begin to be able to accept students who are not going to Columbia University anymore. It's an example. It will happen. But I wish you the best of success. I'm not going to get into any more particulars because of the many people I see that are listening and watching us. Someone is going to say he doesn't really know the Australian scene, so what is he talking about? So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you. We'll go to another question in the chat from Nick. What are your thoughts on the likes of Norman Finkelstein and the damage he causes when he parades himself around the world on talk shows denouncing Zionism and Israel's actions? How do we combat people like him? And I'll give a bit of context. Norman is the son of Holocaust survivors, so very much what we've been talking about tonight, but as we'll talk about more, a very vocal international anti-Israel, anti-Zionist person.
That is true. I am not Norman Finkelstein's psychiatrist, or do I have a degree in psychology. I think there's something very sick there, especially his idea about the Holocaust industry, which is one of his pet phrases, and his willingness to justify almost anything Hamas or Fatah does. I say almost because he does watch himself, but I think there is a clip of Alan Dershowitz and him in debate, maybe from about 3 or 4 months ago. I might be off. That can be instructive and educational about dealing with him and those other people. The Arabs started it out early on. In fact, Menachem Begin, there's an idea that Begin did not want to meet Chancellor Schmidt at the time. I think it was 1983, because Schmidt had said, we owe the Arabs because of what we did to the Jews, and because of the Jews being persecuted by the Germans, look what they did to the Arabs. That was basically the chain of thought. So it's not new. This idea that we Palestinians, as if there's a Palestinian, but we'll not discuss that now with not too much time left, were the victims of the Jews who were the victims of the Germans. As if the Jews showing up in the Mandate of Palestine in 45, 46, 47 somehow were totally disconnected from the Jews who came there in the 1920s and 30s, or the 1880s, or you heard me at the very beginning of the program, from the 1800 years past. It's a corruption of the facts. It's a denial of historical reality of what happened. And anybody who gets into hasbara with Arabs knows that there's nothing they will not flip over, twist about, and turn 180 degrees around. It's a very frustrating experience. And the only thing I can do on to directly answer, there is out there. Other people have taken him on or written about him. Search, or as we say today, go to Rabbi Google, spend 5 minutes, you'll become smarter and more intelligent and more confident. Thank you.
Thank you. We have so many questions tonight. I've got multiple questions coming through in the chat, hands up. We'll go to, this is an interesting question here from David. What do you make, so just to give you a bit of context, with the organizations in Australia, we mentioned the Jewish Council and the, which is our version of the Jewish Voices for Peace. The strategic direction of the communal organizations has been to pretty much pretend they don't exist in order not to give them oxygen. What do you think is the best tactic to combat these? Do we pretend this is not an issue? Do we bring attention to it, discredit? How do we combat this type of anti-Jewish rhetoric?
Well, I will agree that trying to kill a mosquito with a 5-pound hammer can do a lot more damage to your house rather than to the mosquito. And I will also agree, on the other hand, talking about Jewish establishment again, and my experience, of course, is with Israel here, is that any establishment, Israeli, Jewish, or non-Jewish, has a very difficult time dealing with independence. They're very afraid. I call it guerrilla hasbara. So we're caught in a bind here. What I will ask of people who are involved, there's nothing to prevent you from developing posters, developing workshops, developing graphic art, and putting it in a drawer somewhere and waiting for the exact moment you need it. If something comes up, don't feel that you need the Jewish establishment to help you put it out. There are so many platforms, and there are also anonymous platforms that you can use to test the waters, to see how people react to a certain poster, a certain slogan, etc., without taking full responsibility and without breaking the law. So there are options available for those who, let's put it this way. The short answer is I don't believe in avoiding the issue. You're going to eventually come up because you're going to have radio talk show hosts or someone else is going to invite them on. So eventually it's going to come out. There's no way you cannot not deal with it. So don't feel that because you don't have your own platform that you don't do something. You can do something even without either your platform or someone else's establishment platform. Keep thinking, keep generating, keep creating, keep being creative. Eventually, you're going to find out you're worthy and needed at the right moment.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent note to end on. We are just about out of time. I'd like to hand it back to you, Yisrael, just if you'd like to make any closing comments before we end tonight.
First of all, thank you very much for having me on. I didn't expect it to go this way, and I hope I was not too talkative in some of my answers. But I'm Jewish. What can I do? Secondly, I understand Einat is going to be your next guest. So let me take this opportunity to please ask you to convey my best regards to her. It just so happens that we know each other.
Certainly.
Third, be Jewish, be inquisitive, be adventurous, be willing to take risks, be willing to stand up. And remember, being Jewish sometimes is accepting that you're a majority of one, and not to yield, not to surrender, not to give up. There's always a way out of a difficulty. Take along a friend, make up a minyan, be together, realize that you're, let's put it this way, you don't want to be the weakest link in a chain of 3,000 years of legacy, heritage, and history. So I wish you not only the best of luck, but all success. Thank you once again for having me on the program.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the AJA, everybody who's listening in tonight, we've had a phenomenal attendance this evening. We would like to give you our greatest and most heartfelt thank you for coming to join us tonight. You certainly did not talk too much, and we could listen to you for another hour. I know we didn't get around to everyone's questions. You're always welcome to email us and we can reach out after tonight if there's anything else you'd like to clarify with Yisrael. I'll remind everybody this was recorded tonight, so if you'd like to listen to anything back or share with your friends and family, we really do encourage you to do so. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you'd like to say thank you to Yisrael in the chat. But once again, thank you very much for joining us and good evening.